Welcome to anyone watching. What this video shows is the completed full left console from my A10C Simpit, which I use with Digital Combat Simulator. I finally got to finish building this console yesterday, and today I'm now looking to run a full systems test as I bring the whole console online. Rather than working on the Simpit and having the whole thing part complete, I wanted to focus on this console and fully complete it, so that bit's done and part of my Simpit to fly day to day, whilst I'm then separately working on the others. I'll just pan the camera around now so we can have a bit of a closer look at the panels within the console. With something like this, I could almost tweak it and carry on upgrading bits of it forever. So that I'd be happy that it was completed and I could move on, I had to think on what completed would look like for me, and I decided it would be based on 6 requirements. For the 6 requirements for console completion, the first was that all panels would be implemented and working, with the exclusion of the IFF, so that would be built and it'd be present and it'd be ready for me to wire up and bring online if later on I feel that I can use that more within the sim. Second, I wanted additional controls, so I want to get as keyboard free as I can, and I've installed controls which are quite discreet and they have their own separate backlighting to the rest of the console, and when it's not backlit the functional text is not visible. Third, I wanted it painted. I wanted it fully painted with detachable sides, so from an accessibility point of view I can easily get to it, and I wanted it to have kick plates. Fourth, I wanted a maintenance manual, so separate to enjoying putting all that content together, I wanted to have just one reference to hand that's got all the detail, so if I need to go to part of the console and look at something again or revisit something, it's clear exactly how it's all put together. Fifth, I wanted to ensure that all of the wiring was organised and labelled clearly. So there is quite a lot of wiring, partly because I've chosen to feed everything into one central hub. So I really did like the idea of just one hub that the entire Simpit feeds into. So I've made sure that all of the cabling is labelled at either end, and that the connections and wiring at the back of the panels are standardised. The patch panels have labelling at their end, and I've even used certain colours of wire to certain parts of the console. So the forward section has a white cabling, the radio stack has purple, and then the rear end of the console has a grey cable. And 6, I wanted the hub that everything feeds into to be easily accessible, so it would have detachable sides, even a detachable front, and that also it would have a number of power banks clustered in the base, ready to power everything. So for the first completion requirement, I'm now going to look at checking all of the panels are fully working. So for each panel, I'm going to take them one by one. We're going to start with the fuel panel. So if I now look to zoom in on that one there, I've also got a little camera up front, just in front of me here, so when I've zoomed in on it I can bring up a side view just to show the panel I'm interacting with and I can be sure and check that it is updating fully within the sim. So we're good to go on the fuel panel. Right, now let's get in close near the DVADR and the emergency brake. Now interestingly, within the sim, the emergency wheel brake behaves differently based on whether you interact with it using a mouse or a keyboard. With a mouse, either click will put it in a fixed position of either engaged or not. But with a keyboard, it's momentary engagement based on holding the keys. So after having a look at this and having a think on it, I wanted the lever within my Simpit to be a momentary pull lever. To this point, the fuel panel and the DVADR and then the emergency wheel brake, they're as units on their own. They're either DCS BIOS or keyboard encoder based. The auxiliary lighting panel is a point at which you start to have a blend of both within it. So for this panel now, the push buttons and toggles are keyboard encoder, whereas the two dials are potentiometers which are fed through DCS BIOS. You'll notice at the top of the screen there's a bar that's just monitoring the tests that we're doing here, and what it's really looking at is just keeping a count on the total number of inputs and outputs that are through keyboard encoder and DCS BIOS. In the very top right of the screen there's a test status indicator, and what that does is upon the first successful verification of any input or output it flashes green. If then in clicking through the different toggles and switches on the panel you then come back and click one over again that's already been verified, it will flash red just so it's not double counted. Reflecting on the SAS panel here does make me think that in the future indicator lights will have stronger backlighting and text that's only visible when backlit. Now we're at the radio stack, I'll just dim the lights in the room here just so that the camera will better pick up the 7-segment displays for the frequency readout. Something that works well for me within this panel is these rotary encoders, rather than a rotation either clockwise or anti-clockwise leading to either an increase or a decrease in frequency. I've got rotations that will lead to an increase, but then I've put in a speed dial function, as you can see now, where if I click down the rotary encoder it rapidly scrolls through the different frequencies. It was after my ILS prototype, which used a smaller red 7-segment display, that I decided for the radio stack here I wanted larger green displays. I don't think there's any right or wrong with which colour to use, but I am glad I used a larger 7-segment display. Whenever it comes to any output information, I really like it to be quite visible. I think that the frequency selector knobs that I've chosen look fine, and I've done the two-tone colour difference between the VHF AM and FM radios. In the future, when it comes to making these panels, I will start to have a bit of a closer look at the knobs I'm using, perhaps to see whether to model or make some that are more in keeping with exactly what you have in the A10C, that look exactly as you'd find it. this Simpit is definitely not an exact mirrored replication from a look perspective of what you get in the A10C. I'm happy with it. It will fulfill what I want, which is just my own interpretation of that aircraft. I know VR is becoming quite a big thing, and I know my brother, he's quite into his VR headset. And over time, I suppose I'll get even better and better with improved resolution. But I do find there's something to be said about a proper tactile feedback. And I think sitting in this pit and when you're flying, it's quite difficult to describe just how great it is to have all of the physical controls just to hand. So will cockpit building as a niche hobby become less as VR evolves? Be interested to know what people think. If anyone catches this video, perhaps put what your thoughts are in the comments on that. I do plan to put a few extra videos online which will cover some of these additional panels, such as a trim panel here that are built at the point that I was building the console itself to put them into. I did find that getting the coloured outline was a bit of a game, and I did try sort of several attempts at a painted outline, but I did struggle to get that to work effectively. So what you've got here is a laminated cutout, which is adhesed to the panel. For the red toggle protectors, I've just installed a momentary push button just here, so it's able to detect its position within the sim. What's different with this panel is that the 3-position rotary switches are input via DCS BIOS, and they have 3 positions in the sim but only use 2 inputs, whereas the 3-position rotary switches for other panels that have the use of the keyboard encoder use 3 inputs. I've tended to use keyboard encoders for all of the inputs and DCS BIOS for all of the outputs, and there's just a number of times where, like the DVA-DR or the KY58 panel, where DCS BIOS has been used for the inputs as well. The use of the keyboard encoders is more because I just had them. I had them from quite some time ago, and they do work very well in what they do. They're very robust, and you can allocate macros and other things, and you can also allocate keyboard commands for extra controls, which we'll look at a little bit more closely shortly. But ultimately, into the future, for any other aircraft, I think I'd pretty much use just DCS BIOS only, because that does the whole thing. Well, that's the end of the prelim test, and it all looks fine and is working as it should be. The second completion requirement was to have additional controls. So I've added the boot switch for my PC into the console. I found that's quite a handy little mod there, and was definitely worth a little bit of time to add. Other additional controls aren't just about getting away from the keyboard, it's about that it's also quicker to access those functions. The functions in particular I wanted access to were the F keys from F1 to F12, but also I wanted access to the kneeboard to select it and scroll through it, goggles and to alter the brightness, and also things like bring up brief, debrief windows, and be able to pause, active pause, or escape the sim. The 2 sets of additional controls are here and here. They have separate backlighting to the rest of the console, and if I just take a closer look, you can see the additional controls are through 5-way thumb sticks, so they each has the potential to have 5 inputs for up, down, left, right and a centre click. The profile of the thumbsticks is quite discreet and is less than the size of one of the screw heads. So in using these additional controls now, I'm altering the view using some of the F keys. Escape, pause, active pause and map. Moving on to the second set of additional controls, we've got the kneeboard which we can scroll through. We've got the goggles which we can alter the brightness. We can control the rate at which time elapses, slow it up, speed it up, put it back to normal. And then we've got brief, debrief windows, a HUD only view should it be desired, and arm rearm window. Although I've used on average 4 inputs per thumb switch, I've wired in all 5 so I can remap them or add extra in the future as needed. Should I need to access the console for any reason, whether it's some kind of fix or upgrade or anything it might be in the future, I wanted to make sure that the access to it was easy, and as you can see now, detach 4 dome nuts and off the side comes. So if we just take a close look at that now, it's just standard 6mm thick MDF which is primed and painted grey on the front. I've used an aluminium strip as a kick plate to protect it from marks, and a draft excluder which is just a great way of stopping light from bleeding through. So it's straightforward to reattach, and all of the other panels on the sides, they all detach and reattach in exactly the same way. As regards painting the console, I took the MDF, gave it a light sand on the sides. I then used a acrylic base undercoat as a primer, which after that had been painted and dried, I sanded that again on the surface and at the sides, and then following that I was then able to apply the normal paint, which was grey on all of the sides, and I used the same matte black paint on the top pieces of wood as I did for the actual panels themselves. With the amount of wiring and controls that there are within this console and what there will be within the bigger Simpit, I felt it important to record and document exactly how it's all constructed and put together. I do enjoy documenting the build, and I'll put together this manual for my own reference, so if, I don't know, 6 months in the future, for whatever reason, I need to revisit the console and check aspects of the design or make changes, then I can immediately see at a glance how it was all put together. In designing this console and the bigger Simpit, I have decided I really want all of the wiring, everything to be interfaced and to feed into one central hub. Now, this left console will sit at the greatest distance from that hub, hence the length of wiring you see here. None of that wiring will ultimately be seen. All of that wiring will feed through and sit behind the front dash. I wanted to ensure that the patch panels were clearly labelled, and that for all cable used, either end of each cable is clearly labelled too, and that there were different colours of Ethernet cable based on which section of the console the wiring went to. In building the left console, I've standardised my wiring approach, which is something I can now implement and apply to the larger pit. I wanted to ensure that the hub was easily accessible, so this particular one has got 2 detachable sides and a detachable door, so it's really handy for gaining full easy access. I've also created some larger holes at the rear of the back of this server cabinet, so I could feed through obviously a very large amount of wiring, but also have a cluster of power banks there to be able to power everything. Well, that's my Simpit now 1/3 built. It has took quite some time to build this left console, not just from the point of view of the panels within it, but then actually to build the console itself to put them in. A few shout outs. First of all, to FSFE and the developer of DCS BIOS. Thank you for this amazing piece of software, which has really added to this console and achieved the output of indicator lights, 7-segment displays, and other LEDs. It's really added a great aesthetic and brought the whole console alive. And I very much look forward to any other developments in DCS BIOS in the future, and anyone else that's contributing towards that. A big shout out to my father-in-law Phil. Thank you very much, not just for allowing access kindly to your CNC machine, but the vast amount of time that we've spent together cutting these panels. I think we've been cutting them for easily over a year now, and there's been times we've spent days in your garage getting them just right. So I really appreciate that, and everything that I've learnt from that. So thank you. And finally, my partner Claire, who's been very patient and understanding whilst I've, for quite a period of time, been frequently disappearing into the garage very early in the mornings and also sometimes late at night to be able to get this completed. For anyone interested in building something like this, I've added on some extra footage now outlining its build and construction, and thanks for watching. There were 5 steps to building this console. The first was to design it, and to do so accurately and carefully with as precise measurements as possible. The second was to then physically build the console. The third was I needed to modify the panels I had built originally to fit into the console. The fourth was to make sure everything was painted to give it the right look. And then fifth, the final point was to fully integrate all the panels and wire them into a central hub and test. So this is the 3D design of the console, and it's using SketchUp, which is free and online to use. So if we just take a moment to sort of move around and have a closer look at this. So that is what effectively we're looking to build. So to have a look at some of the key parts of the design, we can see that there are a number of panels that you can see here that will be cut. They're 12mm in width for all of them, and all the forward ones have circular holes cut which will reduce weight and allow wiring to pass through. Over on the other side of the console here, you can see there will be battens that are run for the full length of the console, whereas on the other side there'll be a number of smaller battens, and the reason for that is a central area has to be left free and open and have a support and platform which the radio stack will sit on, because that is quite a large and heavy panel. So this additional edge here is where the throttle will sit, and the throttle will be raised slightly on that just to protrude above the rails and then be built into the console. There's also a consideration of a number of different angles in the console. So you've got the inner part sloping upwards, whereas the outer part actually slopes both outwards and upwards at the end, making it a more complex angle. Key measurements: 361mm wide, 1472mm long, and then the inner part of the console is 450mm high, but obviously given the angle it moves across at, it actually will end up just higher over to the left. The rails will be installed into the wood. They're aluminium with a 10mm width, but they're in an L shape, which I found gives it a lot more strength. It's my first time using SketchUp, and I would rate that as a really good program. It's let me design this accurately to the millimetre, and from what I can see, when it's built, the final console should be exactly as seen on screen here. If we look at the 3D design, but also at the same time the CAD CAM program for actually cutting these panels on the CNC machine, we can see the circular cutout, the square cutouts, which there's 4 of them to allow the battens to pass through. Now this particular one here represents the 3rd panel along within the console, so you can see that there are extra screw holes at the bottom there. You've got where the support for the radio stack will butt up against it and have screw holes to be attached, and then further up at the top on the other side of that panel will be obviously the intersecting point of the throttle support. So if we now move to a 3D preview of the machined piece of MDF, and we take away the waste material, we can get a really good idea of what that will look like. So what we're looking at now would be the 3rd panel along. Effectively, they're all going to be very similar. With this one, it's simply what is unique to this particular one is that you've got the positioned screw holes top and bottom to enable the supports both for the radio stack and the throttle. This design now leaves me with a shopping list of the materials to get, so I can now go and build it. So get yourself down the hardware store, and if you're lucky they'll have a free cut-in service. So I've been able to already have these cut to the right width and the right height, which will save a little bit of time when being machined. Having taken the time to design the build to the millimetre, it's really great to be able to use my father-in-law's CNC to therefore have it cut to the millimetre, so I can construct it exactly as I'd outlined. So laid out before us now are all of the prepared materials, all cut to the right length or cut in the right way, machined as needed, all ready to be put together. One of the longer battens here I did actually have to replace. It has got a slight bow in it, and it wasn't until I put it together that did I quite appreciate the effect that would have on the overall console. So before putting the main materials together, I've run a few tests on some scraps. The 3 things I was really looking at is drilling holes in the mounting rails, attaching the aluminium strip into the MDF, and also some of the do's and don'ts around putting screws into MDF, which, as you can see there on that particular bit, you do need to be quite careful. So with all the materials now put together and the console as a frame built, let's see how it turned out relative to the design. So the console as built is pretty much to the millimetre of what was designed. So yeah, I'm pleased with that outcome. And it was important that that would be the case because of the panels that would be mounted into it. There's quite a lot being packed into very tight spaces, and an allowance of literally a millimetre or two for some of the things to be able to fit. One of the big things that became clear during this construction of the console was that the focus on the original panels, on just building them and getting them to work, meant that not a vast amount of consideration at that point was given to the frame that they would eventually sit in, and they simply did not have a great enough width to allow an overhang. So as you can see here, I've had to use 6mm pieces of MDF to insert on either side of every single panel so that it would then have the overhang needed to drop onto those mounting rails. This did create quite a lot of extra work because each panel had components at the rear of it which almost ran to the very edge, so that the pieces of wood used to create the overhang had to be almost made for each one. However, lesson learned, and this is time that I would never need to have to use again, because as I move on to, say, the next console, the right console, I almost begin with a full picture, so I understand exactly how it's all going to go together. So all future panels will be made of a greater width, an extra 22mm on what I was using before. So we're now at the point where all of the panels have all been modified to fit into the console. The console as a body now, as a shell, is complete. It simply is the aesthetic that needs to be added now through painting it. When I look back at this now, it is really unbelievable the difference that painting the MDF makes to the final finish. So now that we know that everything fits together, the whole thing's stripped right back to the frame and it's ready to be painted. I want to test the method of painting before I roll it out to all of the pieces of wood, so I take a couple of pieces here which are sanded and primed with an acrylic based undercoat, and then they're sanded again, and then a spray paint's applied, which in this case for the extensions to the sides of the panels was exactly the same colour used on the panel itself. With that method of painting tested, I now take all of the different pieces of wood, so everything you can see here reflects all of the extensions needed to give a greater width to the panels, and a few blanking plates as well. From the before to after, the transition's really good. Yeah, it makes such a huge difference. I am glad this is time I will not need to spend doing this on any future consoles, because for every one of those screw holes you see, it's exactly aligned to the holes in the mounting rails and the original panels, and a lot of these have unique cutouts so it can snake around the components. I can now move on to the frame and give that the grey finish that it needs. So we can take a quick glance now at either end of the console now it's been sprayed. Here are some of the side panels at different stages in their journey. Here's one piece which has just been sprayed, and then we can see another one a bit further along that's had a kick plate added, and also some draft excluder just at the top there. I haven't worked with wood a great deal and didn't appreciate in painting the one side how it would make the material bow, so I had a lot of light that was bleeding through. So a good shout by my father-in-law to use some draft excluder, which as you can see creates a perfect seal to stop the light bleeding through. So following painting, the whole console's being built right back up now, and we're at a point that we can now get it to start talking to the sim. In integrating all of the panels into the console, that also related to adding additional controls. So here's one of the first ones I added, the ability to turn on the PC from within the console itself. A handy mod, and one that left the original on switch in place but just added this second one. There were other additional controls I wanted. I wanted them to be discreet, so I went for 5-way thumbsticks. You can see a couple here. Even on a 10x10 profile, some have a much smaller actuator than others, so I went for the smallest I could find. I then soldered them to some Veriboard circuits that I made that had some Molex style connectors at the back, which then fed into keystone jacks. When not backlit, I didn't want any text that detailed the function of them to be visible, so effectively you wouldn't know that they're there. But when backlit, I wanted it to appear, so here you can see me experimenting with different ways of hiding text but then revealing it when backlit. So I've built 2 of these which have separate backlighting to the rest of the console, and if at any time we're not in use, the backlighting is deactivated, the text fades away to nothing. A huge part of this console build was to change the hub that lay at the centre of it. So what we're looking at now is one of the first types of hubs I ever put together. It houses one keyboard encoder, a simple wooden frame, not efficient in its use of space, and plus at the time I was experimenting with lots and lots of different kinds of connectors, so I had panels talking to it through VGA leads, both new and old style. You can even see there a SCART lead. I used one of those to trial, and then ultimately a keystone jack, which is what I settled on. So now, with an idea of the total number of inputs for the Simpit as a whole and a standardised wiring approach that I've now used, it was time to move on and upgrade to a whole new hub, which is what we're looking at here. So this is a small data / server cabinet which will house all of the keyboard encoders, all of the microcontrollers. They'll all be fed into patch panels to allow standard use of Ethernet cables, which is my preferred method of connection. And here you can see some early tests from the newly built console to get that talking to the new hub that I'm constructing. Well, here is a massive wiring which is what will be used to allow the console to be fed into the hub. With such a vast amount of wiring, I got a lot of it on discount, and that did mean moving from stranded cable to some solid core. So I'm running a test here now where I've purposely took a solid core Ethernet cable and really created some tight kinks in it to test that it is still working, because that is one of the criticisms of that type of wire. But in running some tests and really putting it through its paces, encountered no problems at all. So this is a mounting plate that I've built, which will allow me to put the microcontroller into one of the cantilever shelves within the data cabinet. So I've spent a good bit of time looking at how the wiring will be interfaced from this and future consoles into the hub, and I've got a clear plan in mind now for how that will work. Well, here we are now at the end of the construction. All that's literally left to do at this point is just to clip the sides on. So I hope this video has been of some use for people watching, and I've started to document the build at mysimpit.co.uk, so over time I'll be adding more content there, so feel free to have a look, and thanks for watching.